Okay, I'm going to talk today about MarkLogic Workflow. First of all, what happens currently to content? What happens if you need to process some content? Well, let's have a look. So normally what we do at the moment is we get our content and we load it into a MarkLogic database. So you might have, for example, a document as we have here, and we might load that into MarkLogic. We might also, could be anything there really, it could be a tweet, could be an email, could be an image really. But effectively all of these things get added into MarkLogic, into our database. Like so. Yep. So they end up in MarkLogic, that's great. But I want to conditionally maybe route this to a person. So how do I go from here to here? Now, I've got my content, maybe I want it to be an approval workflow, maybe I want it to be, I don't know, just a notification that something's happened. So really, how do I get the content in there? That's the big question. So we can load content, we can search it, we can edit it, but how do I get that to my human for some working on? Well, there's a few ways I can do that. So for example, I might have a whole bunch of servers, and there might be BPM servers, for example. So for example, I might have these things here. Just drag that on. So I might have 3 servers there, for example, and they may be, for example, BPM servers. Of course, being BPM, that means I've probably actually got a relational database kicking around. Remember those things? Yeah, so I might have an RDBMS there to store the state from these things. So there we go, store the state for the BPM. And what we might do is we might have some sort of action there, then lets the BPM engine know that the content's gotten there. So we have connected to BPM, we then have a relational database to store the state, that's kind of churning away in the background, and then somehow we might design a some sort of interface for a human to use. So there'll be some sort of user interface for this BPM system that we'll have to develop, and then the user just accesses that BPM system. So that's typically the way things go. But the thing is, a lot of customers may already have MarkLogic. They may not have a BPM system. So really, for the content you put in MarkLogic, say you only wanted to route maybe 10 or 5% of it for some manual check-in, maybe you're receiving some grants or some financial information, you just want to do a manual check every so often, then this kind of architecture is quite heavyweight. So what we might do instead is have another way of working. What we want to do really is just have something simple that sits between the MarkLogic database and the user and enables them to do the workflow they need. And as an example of that workflow, here we go. We've got we've got a simple workflow here. So for example, the document is created or updated and we start the process here. We then check to see whether that document has been flagged as approved or rejected before. If it has, then we don't process it again, there's no point. But if it is truly a new version and has been submitted for approval, then we route that to a human. We ask the human to make a decision, and they can say either approved or rejected. And then based on that decision they make, if it's approved, we then change the document property to be approved and send an email, congratulations, it's approved, with a link, and then finish the process. Otherwise, if it's rejected, we set the collection maybe to rejected or set some property on the document, and then send a different email saying, oops, it's rejected, please go fix, and then end the process. And then when the user resubmits the document, say it has been rejected, it goes through this process again, and so on and so forth. So quite a straightforward little process there. A full-fledged BPM engine is a bit overkill for this type of thing. So what have we got in MarkLogic that can help? Well, we do have something that's kind of like a workflow. It's more of a document state engine if you think of it like that. And really, all this works on is, this is called Content Processing Framework. So this is the Content Processing Framework, commonly known as CPF. And content processing framework is a pretty cool bit of kit that we often don't talk about. No particular reasons, no conspiracy. It's just that it's a very specific use case for CPF, and it doesn't quite do everything, but it does do a lot of useful things. So the two most common places for this are to power our alerting capability in MarkLogic, but also to process documents as they come in. So if you get a new XLSX Excel file, it might unpack that and process that, or Word file and convert that to text so it can be searched, for example. But this is roughly how it works. So basically, a document state event happens. It's either created or updated, and there is a trigger that is set up either on the collection, so a particular correction either to a single depth or to infinite depth, or on the document URI, so where it is filed into the database, again to single depth or infinite. And then based on this domain, this is a CPF domain configuration, the trigger will then fire off an appropriate set of pipelines. Now the initial state of any pipeline is initial and the final state is done. That's defined by the CPF status change handler by default. But what you can do is you can define your own states in between, and it's like a finite state automator, if any of you remember that from computer science. But if not, think of it as a one-directional flow. You can flow in between states. You could have a third one up here that you flow to and from, but say in a simple example you've got a state here, state 1, and there may be two actions. Maybe we're extracting some text or enriching the document with an external engine. State 2, we may decide to conditionally run an action. You can have conditions on these. If the condition's false, then it can just carry on or stop where it is. And equally, a final state could have a final action on it, or indeed no action. And then once all the processing is done, that's completed, marked as complete. And this is CPF, and this runs as a post-commit trigger. So the transaction is complete, and then at some point very quick afterwards, this fires. And within the context of a single transaction, the initial state is checked, and all these states are processed. So it's important that these things don't overlap. These states can only occur on a single document because the states are handled within the properties of that document as well. So what can we do with this, and crucially, what can't we do with this? Well, it is very, very useful. We can use it for a whole bunch of things, but there are a few crucial drawbacks. So what if you want to be very selective on the document? So you only want to fire this thing if some data within the document, not where it's stored or what collection it's in, but some data within the document is changed. Also, if you need to route it to a human, there's no humans here. This is just about processing the document, going through its life cycle, if you think of it that way. So there's no humans there involved. Indeed, CPF runs through and then stops. There is no concept of a long-running CPF process. It moves state and then stops until another action occurs, and then the document's updated. Also, what if you want to have a workflow for creating content? This is about what happens when content is already created. But if you want to create a process and discuss how to create a document, then how do you do that? You can't really do it with CPF. Also, you can only process one document because the properties of the CPF are held against a single document. So how do you manage multiple documents or zero documents? You can't do that either. And what happens if you want to have parallel steps? If you want to have one person maybe creating imagery content for a news article, another person researching it, and another person writing the journalistic content, how do you go and do that? You can't do parallel processing with CPF either. So you can't use CPF to do these things without a significant amount of work. However, it is possible. So we've had 2 partners and 1 customer use CPF to create a kind of workflow system. But what I've come up with is something a little bit different and a little more standard. So what I've come up with is MarkLogic Workflow. The way this works is, again, your document is added to the MarkLogic database. But then you can use an alert rather than a CPF domain to fire it. And alerts are very granular. So you can use any standard MarkLogic query in an alert, so it could be any value within the document, a combination of values, whether they are there or not there. You can do quite a lot in there, including geospatial search even. So alerting is a lot more flexible than a domain, because you can do collection and URI and a whole bunch of these things as well. What we then do is we create a process document, so a document just to hold the state of a process, and it is that process document that CPF manages, not the original attachment. What we do though is we create an attachment, and this is just a URI, and we write an element within the document and say, oh, by the way, this is the attachment that started off the process. You can have multiple documents in there, you can have no documents in there. That's the beauty of it. So the process document is what manages the state. And of course that process document is saved in MarkLogic. Now the beauty of this system is we create this process document in a special location. And that special location is monitored by MarkLogic Workflow CPF domain. So this is quite straightforward. A new process document is created. That means we need to figure out what's going on. So post commit trigger fires in CPF. CPF takes a look at it, decides that it needs to go in the initial state, and then fires the MarkLogic Workflow Handler. MarkLogic Workflow Handler looks at the document, looks at what type it is, looks where it's been located, and determines which MarkLogic workflow, and crucially which version of the MarkLogic workflow to execute. And then that document is processed as normal. So there could be, for example, a whole bunch of things going on. Crucially, there could also be lots of sub-processes going on, lots of parallel working going on. So for example, there could be a parallel gateway here. This is BPMN terminology. And what we do is we actually create a sub-process document internally, and that goes through a sub-process. So when MarkLogic Workflow's importer runs, we actually look at the BPMN2 model, see where all these forks and rendezvous are, sub-processes, that sort of thing, and generate a whole bunch of different but very small CPF pipeline configurations for them. This means that within our main workflow, we can create 3 sub-process documents and create some state within our parent document. Tell these documents that they are sub-processes, and then as they go through their workflow and complete, they then update their status within the main process document. When all 3 are done, because they're updating the document, the CPF pipeline for the main workflow decides, well, actually all of these things have returned or they've errored or something like that, but they're all complete, and then I can carry on processing, eventually having the process finish. So you can have very, very sophisticated workflows to any depth within MarkLogic Workflow. It scales very, very well. Equally though, it doesn't have to have kicked off the process due to a content activity. It could instead be created via a REST API call. So this means we can actually instantiate a process without an attachment. So this enables you to create a process without attachments, or create processes with multiple attachments. So if you did want a discussion process to discuss how you're going to create some content before you create it, you can support that as well. And that's how MarkLogic Workflow works. So hopefully you can see that this is a valuable project to add into your MarkLogic system, and I'll record further videos to explain it in greater detail. Thank you very much.